This on the heels of news that broke this morning that Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, two Canadians who, on this day 2 years ago, were arrested on what is believed to be erroneous and false and drummed-up charges in retaliation for the arrest of Meng Wanzhou. Now, the report that came out of China this morning and translated by the Associated Press, I believe it was, said that the two had been tried in a Chinese court, indicted and tried. Now, that would be a very, very strong move by the Chinese government because there would have been no Canadian representation there. There was none. So, again, we were waiting for confirmation of whether or not that did happen. What we can tell you is that there was a translation error, and somewhere along the line of communication, there was a verb tense that was incorrectly translated. And the two Canadian men have not been indicted and tried. Now, whether or not that changes Erin O'Toole's approach to how the Trudeau government has been handling that case and other issues with China probably doesn't change at all. But for more, I want to bring in Tom Mulcair, who joins me now, of course, former leader of the NDP and one of our political analysts. Tom, good to see you this morning. So glad you could.
Great to be with you, Jennifer. Great
so good you could join us on this because this is a developing story. And in some ways, it's good news that the two Canadian men have not been indicted and tried at this point.
The Canadian government, like the U.S. government under Biden, who's coming in as the new administration, and the Chinese government are all going to have to find a face saver on this one. We tragically decided to play the game of the guy with the orange hair, Donald Trump, who's on his way out. Let him go back to Celebrity Apprentice. But for a while there, he was president of the United States, and he dragged us into something horrible, which was the detention of somebody for political purposes, which is, of course, in flagrant contravention of Canada's own Extradition Act. But Meng Wanzhou was still held here, obviously in completely different conditions than the two Michaels in China. Their detention is tit for tat. We know that. It's retaliation. The Chinese have never made too many attempts to hide that. With regard to the U.S. and the Biden administration, he can't appear to be weak compared to Trump when he's dealing with China. So I think that the best news that came out was in the New York Times earlier in the week saying, looks like there's a deal in the works to let her go back to China. That would allow the Chinese, of course, still unrelated, to let the two Michaels come back here. It's a tragic situation, but it shouldn't distract from the fact that fundamentally, Erin O'Toole is raising a very important point. You know, Rosalie Abella, the Supreme Court Justice, gave an important speech, the Elie Wiesel speech at the Raoul Wallenberg Center yesterday, and she was reminding us of the importance of standing up on these questions of human rights. When you look at the treatment of the Uyghurs in Western China, she's calling on the world to look at those situations and remember what happened in Darfur, remember what happened in Rwanda. Yes. Remember the Nuremberg trials. And when you don't act on these issues and you're pushed back by a very powerful Chinese government, then these terrible things are allowed to happen. And I think Mr. O'Toole is showing strong leadership on this issue.
He was also asked, so what would he have done differently in terms of the approach in getting these two Canadian men released? He said he would have, leaned more on our allies, which the Trudeau government says it's done. But he also said he would invoke Maginski sanctions from the Maginski Act, which is basically to punish China, punish anyone, business leaders, what have you, in terms of freezing their assets, even banning them from coming to Canada or even having them booted out of Canada. But Tom, China wields a very large hammer, much larger than what Canada does, and it can be extremely punitive. We've seen that with canola, with soybean, with pork. So can Canada's position be criticized at this point?
I think that Mr. O'Toole's reference to Australia was spot on, because the Australians are showing that they know how to push back. They're not going to be bullied on the international stage. They're a small power like we are, and we call ourselves a middle power. We're not that middle. We're lower middle. We're not that powerful on the world stage, but we've got a lot of powerful allies. We are a G7 country. We're in NATO, and we do have allies that we have to work with. We've got to come to understand that if we allow this bullying to continue, then it simply will go to the next stage. And unless you stand up to a bully, this is what you get back. The Chinese have a pat answer to this. Jennifer, they'll always tell you, look, we have 1.5 million people. We know how to clothe, feed, house, provide education and healthcare to 1.5 billion people, and we don't need to take lessons from anybody else on this issue. That's their answer on human rights.
Okay.
But human rights go beyond that. And this is the world stage. And since the end of the Second World War, we're supposed to be working towards greater human rights. But we had a step back for 4 years on profound democratic principles with the arrival of Donald Trump. Now it's time to start making up some of that lost ground. And I think that Erin O'Toole is putting a stake in the ground on this one and saying, look, I'm going to fight this good fight. If there's one country that should understand Huawei and why we shouldn't be allowing Huawei in, it's Canada. Huawei was built on the ashes of Nortel, a great Canadian company, and this has been proven. There's no question about this. Huawei was based on stolen information, stolen intellectual property from Nortel, and Nortel went bankrupt, and Huawei is now trying to sell back the improved version of that technology to Canada. It's galling, and it's a security issue, and we should do two things. We should send Wang Mengzhou back to China because we are holding her in contravention of our own law, and we constantly boast of being a country based on the rule of law, and we're breaking our own law when we hold her. And we should also send Huawei packing and tell them, you're not invited into Canada. You can't work here.
Tom, so much to unpack. I wish we had more time, but I have to leave it there. Always appreciate your insight.
Good to talk with you.
You
All
too.
the best.